A homeless woman, weary and forgotten, approached Shaquille O'Neal on the bustling streets of Los Angeles, her trembling voice asking for just $1. She expected nothing more than a fleeting glance or a polite refusal. Yet, Shaq's unexpected kindness brought her more than she dared to hope for, transforming her life in ways she had never imagined. Before we begin this inspiring story, let us know where you're watching from. If you love stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. On the busy corner of Hollywood Boulevard, where neon lights mingled with the hurried footsteps of passers-by, Mrs. Margaret sat huddled on an old cardboard sheet. Her tattered coat couldn't shield her from the cold wind sneaking between the tall buildings. Her shoes, worn to the point of exposing her toes, seemed ready to fall apart at any moment. Her tangled, unwashed gray hair clung to her aged, haggard face, etched with deep lines from years of hardship. In front of her lay a hastily written cardboard sign, "I'm hungry. Please help." The letters had faded with dirt and time, yet still conveyed a desperate plea from a tired and wounded heart. Passers-by hurried along, no one looking back. Margaret, with sorrowful eyes, watched them like an invisible shadow. Some even crossed to the other side of the street, avoiding eye contact with her. Those unfamiliar faces, with their indifferent gazes, reminded her that she was no longer part of this world. Looking down at the few coins scattered on the ground, she sighed. They weren't enough to buy a piece of bread. Her empty, aching stomach made her long for the days when meals were easy to come by. But now, finding a simple meal had become a luxury. Margaret's eyes blurred, whether from the cold wind or tears. The tears fell silently but heavily. Amidst the bustling crowd, she felt like an abandoned soul, lost in a vibrant and glamorous world. "Does anyone see me?" she silently asked herself, but no one stopped to answer. The late afternoon breeze swept by, carrying a slight chill in the fading rays of the setting sun. Margaret glanced down at the meager coins before her, telling herself it was time to pack up. But just as she reached for the cardboard sign, a tall figure suddenly cast a shadow, blocking the light. She looked up, her eyes meeting a man dressed in a black hoodie and simple basketball shorts. Sunglasses obscured part of his face, but the eyes behind them shone with warmth and gentleness, a stark contrast to the indifference Margaret was accustomed to from passers-by. Startled, she recoiled slightly, her heart filled with skepticism. Previous encounters had often led to mockery, or worse, intentional trouble. She had met many who exploited her vulnerable situation to heap scorn or unwarranted anger upon her. "Hello," the man spoke, his deep voice comforting like a balm. "How's your day been?" Margaret stiffened, her eyes scrutinizing the stranger's face. She wasn't used to unexpected kindness, especially from a young, towering man like him. His tone confused her. It lacked pity and bore no hint of ridicule. She stammered, her throat tightening. "I'm just trying to earn some money for food." Her voice trailed off, shame washing over her as she reflected on her circumstances. The man remained silent for a moment, as if contemplating something. Then he bent down, lowering his sunglasses slightly to reveal his face. It was a face Margaret couldn't forget. Though she wasn't a basketball fan, even on this street corner, the image of Shaquille O'Neal, the NBA legend, was unmistakable. Margaret's mouth fell open, words failing her. She blinked, thinking she was dreaming or mistaken, but Shaq's smile, warm and genuine, made her believe this was real. "Today, I'm going to help you," Shaq said, his tone simple yet resolute. "Shall we start with a meal?" Margaret couldn't respond immediately. A whirlwind of emotions surged within her: astonishment, doubt, and a flicker of hope. "Really? You truly want to help me?" she asked, her eyes wary, fearing this was another cruel joke. "Yes." Shaq nodded, his sincere gaze dispelling all doubts. "Today is your day. Come on, let's go." He extended his hand, a simple gesture laden with meaning. Margaret hesitated, her eyes drifting to her rough hands and trembling legs. But finally, she reached out and grasped Shaq's hand. It was the first time in years she didn't feel lost in this world. They walked along the bustling sidewalk, curious glances turning their way. Some recognized Shaq and pulled out their phones to take pictures. Margaret keenly felt those gazes, and the sudden attention made her anxious. "Why are they staring at us?" Margaret whispered, her voice tinged with worry. Shaq turned, his smile unwavering. "Maybe they recognize me," he said gently, aiming to reassure her. "But don't worry. You're with me. There's nothing to fear." Those words, though simple, wrapped around Margaret's cold heart like a warm blanket. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her that way. Ahead, the sign of a BBQ restaurant glowed in the twilight, promising something warmer and more fulfilling than the hunger-filled days Margaret had endured. Her journey began to change from that moment. Margaret felt her palm still resting in Shaq's hand. His large, warm hand gave her an inexplicable sense of safety. She hesitated briefly, then stood up. Her legs trembled, weakened from sitting on the curb all day, and the gnawing hunger that wouldn't relent. She practically had to lean on Shaq just to stay balanced. As they made their way toward a nearby BBQ joint, the neon lights of Hollywood Boulevard started to glow, highlighting the contrast between the two. One was a basketball legend, towering and confident. The other was a frail, elderly woman, her weary eyes and tattered clothes reflecting a life of hardship. Instantly, they drew attention. Curious, astonished, and questioning glances came from the passers-by. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. "Is that Shaquille O'Neal? What's he doing with that old lady? What's going on here?" Some didn't stop at just looking. They pulled out their phones, snapping photos and recording videos either surreptitiously or openly, the cameras fixated on Shaq and Margaret as if capturing something extraordinary, something they couldn't quite understand. Margaret noticed it all. She lowered her head, her body shrinking inward under the weight of shame. The unexpected attention felt like hundreds of needles piercing her already diminished pride. "What are they staring at?" she asked softly, her voice almost swallowed by the crowd. Shaq heard her, turned, and offered a gentle smile. "They probably recognize me," he said, his tone calm and reassuring. "But don't worry. If you're with me, you're safe." His words were a protective shield. Margaret tried to take a deep breath, her steps steadying slightly. But the unease lingered. A group of young people standing nearby whispered among themselves, then burst out laughing. One of them pointed toward Margaret and sneered, "Look at that. Looks like Shaq's taking a homeless grandma out on a date." Shaq caught the comment clearly. He paused briefly, his eyes flashing with a hint of sternness. Then he turned back to Margaret, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Ignore them," he said. "People can think whatever they want. What matters is I'm here to help you tonight." Margaret didn't reply, but a complicated emotion welled up inside her, shame intertwined with gratitude. She was used to derision and hurtful words, but Shaq's patience and calmness softened the sting, if only for a moment. As they continued walking, the BBQ place came into view. its neon sign showing a cheerful pink pig holding a fork. The savory scent of grilled meat and spices wafted through the night air. "Do you like barbecue?" Shaq asked, breaking the awkward silence. Margaret couldn't help but let out a small, light laugh, the first in a long time. "I do," she replied, her voice quiet but sincere. "Good," Shaq said, his bright smile returning. "Tonight, you're going to eat all you want." But behind them, the stares remained, some filled with wonder and admiration, others laced with judgment or curiosity. What they didn't know was that inside the BBQ restaurant, more than just a meal would be shared. It would mark the beginning of something far more significant, a glimmer of light in the dark expanse of Margaret's life. The BBQ restaurant door swung open, and an irresistible aroma of smoky flavors immediately wafted out, mingling the scent of grilled meat, spicy seasonings, and the rich sweetness of barbecue sauce. Margaret stepped in slowly, feeling as if she had entered a completely different world. She took a deep breath, her stomach growling fiercely in response. How long had it been since she'd encountered a smell so inviting, one that made her want to dive into a meal right away? Shaq smiled as he noticed the spark in Margaret's eyes, as if he had anticipated her reaction. They walked up to the counter, where golden brown grilled meats were neatly arranged behind the clear glass display. The menu above offered an array of choices: pulled pork, barbecue ribs, honey-glazed chicken, accompanied by sides like mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, and buttery cornbread. "Order whatever you'd like," Shaq said with a cheerful tone. Margaret looked up at the menu, the brightly lit words almost teasing her. She felt overwhelmed. There were too many delicious options, and she didn't know where to begin. A part of her wanted to try everything, but another part hesitated. Years of hunger on the streets had taught her to only take what others were willing to offer, never daring to ask for more. "I'll just take something small," she murmured, her eyes dropping to the floor in embarrassment. Shaq leaned down, placing a warm but firm hand on her shoulder. His voice was gentle but resolute. "No, today you're going to eat to your heart's content. I promise you'll leave here full." The young woman behind the counter, whose eyes widened in recognition upon seeing Shaq, offered a polite smile. "Please, ma'am, take your pick. We have anything you'd like." Margaret glanced up again, hesitantly pointing to the pulled pork and a small side of mashed potatoes. "I think this is enough," she said softly. Shaq shook his head and chuckled. "Not enough. She'll also have a plate of BBQ ribs, cornbread, and a large sweet tea," he told the cashier. Then, turning to Margaret, he winked. "Don't worry, I know you're going to love it." Before Margaret could protest, Shaq had already added more to the order. When the cashier announced the total, he pulled out a crisp $100 bill and handed it over without a second thought. "Keep the change," he said with a friendly smile. The cashier stammered her thanks, clearly still processing the fact that she was serving NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal. Margaret watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and unease. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. "I'm not worth all this trouble." Shaq turned to her, his gaze firm yet kind. "Don't ever say that. Everyone deserves kindness, Margaret, and today is your day. Don't turn it down." Margaret nodded slightly, but a lingering doubt remained in her heart. Why would someone like him, famous, wealthy, go out of his way to help someone like her? As the two of them sat by a window, their table was soon filled with steaming plates of food. Margaret stared at the feast before her, her eyes welling up with tears. A full, sumptuous meal, all for her, a person society had rendered invisible. Shaq looked at her with a reassuring smile. "Try it. I bet you'll love it." Margaret picked up a piece of BBQ rib, hesitating briefly. But as she took her first bite, the sweet, tangy sauce and tender meat melted in her mouth. She couldn't stop a tear from sliding down her cheek as she ate. "It's so good," she whispered, though her emotions ran much deeper. For the first time in years, she felt seen. She felt remembered. Shaq sat back silently, letting Margaret savor this rare moment. But he knew this was just the beginning. There was so much more ahead to help turn her life around. Margaret took her first bite of the roasted pork sandwich. The smoky, savory flavor of the meat melded perfectly with the soft bread, stopping her in her tracks. Her eyes grew misty, not from the spice, but from the emotions flooding her. How long had it been since she last sat down to eat like a normal person, enjoying a warm, complete meal? Shaq sat across from her, leaning back in his chair, watching her with quiet patience. He didn't say a word, just smiled encouragingly as she silently ate. She set the sandwich down and looked up at Shaq. There was something in his gentle gaze that made her feel, for the first time in a long while, that someone truly wanted to hear her story. She hesitated, then took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "I used to have a family." Shaq leaned forward slightly, his attention fully on Margaret. "Tell me about them." Margaret looked down at her frail hands, hands that had once cared for her family but now bore the marks of time and hardship. "My husband, he passed away 10 years ago. Cancer. After that, it was just me. I worked in a sewing factory trying to keep the small house we used to live in. But then my health started to fail, and I couldn't keep working. I couldn't pay the rent, and they kicked me out." She paused, struggling to hold back the emotions welling up inside her. "I tried. I really tried. But when you're all alone, everything becomes so much harder. Slowly, I lost everything, and eventually, I ended up here, on the streets." Shaq didn't interrupt, only nodding, his eyes filled with empathy. She continued, her voice hoarse from years of being unheard. "On the streets, people don't see me as a person. They look through me, or worse, at me, like I'm trash. Sometimes I even ask myself, do I really exist?" Margaret stopped, tears streaming down her deeply lined face. She felt vulnerable sharing these truths, but Shaq's steady gaze and patient presence made her feel safe enough to go on. Shaq sighed and leaned in closer. "Margaret, I can't imagine what you've been through, but I believe one thing. Things will get better. Today is just the beginning. I'm here to help." Margaret looked at him, her eyes a mixture of surprise and gratitude. She had heard promises of help before, but people always disappeared as soon as they turned away. Yet there was something different about Shaq, a sincerity that made her believe he truly cared. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for not looking at me the way everyone else does." Shaq smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Margaret, everyone deserves to be treated like a human being. You don't need to thank me. Just believe that things will change from here." In a corner of the diner, a group of younger diners had started watching them. Murmurs rippled through their group. "What's he doing with that homeless woman? Is that Shaquille O'Neal? Weird? She looks so pathetic, doesn't she?" Margaret didn't hear the remarks, but Shaq did. He turned his head, giving the group a stern look. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the group fell silent. Shaq turned back to Margaret, placing his hand on the table as if to reassure her. "Don't mind them," he said softly. "They don't understand, but that doesn't matter. Let's just focus on finishing our meal." Margaret nodded, but a vague unease stirred in her chest. She wasn't used to being under the gaze of so many people, and even faint whispers made her uncomfortable. Yet, when she looked at Shaq, she felt a sense of calm. They continued their meal, with Margaret slowly opening up about her story. Bit by bit, she felt the heavy weight inside her begin to lift. In the corner, curious eyes still lingered, but for Margaret, this was the first time she no longer felt invisible. Shaq wasn't just giving her a meal. He was giving her something far greater, the feeling that she still mattered in this world. After a hearty meal and heartfelt conversation, Shaq stood up and gently patted Margaret on the shoulder. "Now, we have one more thing to do," he said with a cryptic smile. Margaret looked up at him, confused but hesitant to ask. They left the BBQ restaurant and strolled along Hollywood Boulevard. The lights from the neon signs reflected off the wet pavement, creating a scene that was both dazzling and surreal, far removed from Margaret's ordinary life. Margaret said nothing, silently following Shaq. When they stopped in front of an upscale spa, she froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. The large sign with gleaming golden letters, the softly lit interior, and the plush leather chairs made her feel as if she had stepped into another world, a world she believed she didn't belong to. I don't belong here," she murmured, her eyes awkwardly dropping to her worn-out shoes. Shaq smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Margaret, you deserve to feel better. Trust me." Reluctantly, Margaret stepped inside, feeling as though just setting foot in the place would shatter the pristine atmosphere. The receptionist looked up and, upon recognizing Shaq, immediately stood, her smile both flustered and polite. "Hello, Mr. Shaquille O'Neal," she stammered. "It's an honor to have you here. How can we assist you today?" Shaq nodded toward Margaret. "I want you to take care of her, everything, make her feel brand new. Can we start?" The receptionist was briefly taken aback when her eyes fell on Margaret, but quickly recovered her professional demeanor. "Of course, we'd be delighted." Margaret fidgeted, about to say something, but Shaq signaled her to relax. A staff member appeared, bowing slightly with a gentle smile, and invited Margaret to follow. "We'll take great care of you. This way, please." Margaret walked with a mix of apprehension and embarrassment. The staff member led her to a private room bathed in soft lighting and filled with the soothing scent of essential oils. The spa session began with Margaret's tangled silver hair. It was carefully washed with warm water, every knot gently untangled. Margaret sat silently, her eyes closed, feeling the water cascade over her scalp as if it was washing away years of burdens she had carried. After washing and drying, they trimmed her hair, revealing a tired but strangely radiant face. Next, they tended to her weathered skin, their expert hands smoothing and refreshing it. Margaret's skin felt soft and clean, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. Finally, they guided her to a private shower where steaming water awaited. Margaret stood under the stream, letting it pour over her thin frame. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth cleanse not just her body, but her weary soul, dissolving layers of grime, exhaustion, and old, painful memories. When Margaret emerged, a staff member waited with new clothes Shaq had arranged. It was a cozy, dark blue sweater, soft jeans, and comfortable shoes. Margaret put them on, feeling as though the new outfit was more than just clothing. It was a shield of dignity and self-worth, something she hadn't felt in a long time. When Margaret returned to the main lobby, Shaq was lounging on a large leather chair, scrolling through his phone. At the sound of her footsteps, he looked up and broke into a broad smile. "Margaret, look at you," Shaq said, his deep voice warm with excitement. "You're not the same Margaret I met earlier. You're a whole new person." Margaret glanced at herself in the nearby mirror. Her face was clean, her hair neat, and the new clothes made her almost unrecognizable. For the first time in years, she felt like a real person again. She turned back to Shaq, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Shaq stood and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "No need to thank me. I just wanted you to feel like you deserved this. Because you do." Margaret nodded, though disbelief lingered in her heart. She was so used to being overlooked, rejected. Tonight, for the first time, she felt seen and acknowledged. Shaq's reassuring smile deepened. "Now, what do you say? We've got one more stop to make." "What stop?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. "We're going to finish this transformation properly," Shaq said, his eyes gleaming. "Trust me, you're going to love it." Margaret didn't ask further, quietly following him out the door. The night had descended over Hollywood, but within her, a light was beginning to glow, warm and radiant, like the very neon signs illuminating the boulevard. The spa door swung open, and Margaret stepped out under the glittering neon signs. The cool evening air brushed against her freshly cleansed face and neatly combed hair. Outside, Shaq stood waiting, his hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie, his eyes lighting up as he spotted her. He raised one hand, forming an imaginary film director's frame with his fingers, squinting at Margaret through the frame. "Hollywood's gonna call you up any day now," he joked, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to melt away the last traces of her hesitation. Margaret laughed, a soft, tentative sound, but genuine, as if she were learning how to welcome joy back into her life. How long had it been since she felt even a shred of confidence? The feeling was foreign, exhilarating, and frightening all at once. Outside the spa, a small group of people loitered on the sidewalk, their curious gazes fixed on the pair. Some recognized Shaq, their murmurs and pointing fingers making their attention obvious. One man in the group whispered to his friend, loud enough for Shaq and Margaret to hear, "What's going on? What's he doing with that old lady?" Margaret froze, her thin shoulders tensing. The words, though indirect, stabbed at her long-eroded self-esteem like needles. Shaq glanced at the man, a flicker of sternness flashing through his eyes. He said nothing but offered a faint smile that carried enough authority to silence the group, their eyes quickly darting away. He turned back to Margaret, leaning in close. "Don't pay them any mind," he said softly, his deep voice wrapping around her like a comforting blanket. "People like that are everywhere, but they don't define your worth." Margaret looked up into Shaq's earnest eyes. A trace of doubt lingered, but his warmth seemed to dispel some of her fear. She nodded and took another step forward, leaving the judgmental stares behind. As they continued down the sidewalk, the curious gazes trailed after them. A young woman, live-streaming on her phone, whispered, "Guys, look at this. That's Shaquille O'Neal. But what's he doing with some homeless old lady? She pointed her phone toward Margaret, zooming in as if to scrutinize her. Margaret caught sight of the camera and instinctively lowered her head, trying to avoid it. Shaq noticed immediately. He stepped forward, placing himself between Margaret and the phone, his tone calm but firm. "She's my friend. Show her some respect, okay?" The young woman stammered, her hands trembling under the weight of Shaq's presence. I was just filming," she muttered, her gaze flickering between embarrassment and uncertainty. Shaq didn't reply, only offering a faint, knowing smile. But his steady, serious gaze was enough to make the woman lower her phone and scurry away. Margaret watched Shaq in silence, a wave of indescribable emotion washing over her, gratitude mixed with awe at the way he stood up for her. "You didn't have to do that," Margaret said quietly, her voice trembling. Shaq turned to her, his smile gentle. "It's the least I could do. No one has the right to make you feel like you're not enough." His words stirred memories of the many years Margaret had endured pain. She recalled the insults hurled at her on the streets, the disdainful looks, the mocking laughter as she begged for spare change. She remembered the cruel hands that shoved her away from street corners she tried to claim as her own, and the kicks that knocked over the little box of coins she had painstakingly gathered. But today, she had met someone who saw her, someone who didn't just look but defended her. Warmth spread through her chest, like a ray of light piercing through the darkness that had shrouded her life for so long. Shaq led Margaret to a nearby clothing store. As they stepped through the large glass doors, a sales associate immediately approached, her eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. O'Neill, it's an honor to have you here. What can I help you with today?" Shaq smiled and gestured toward Margaret. "She needs some new clothes. Let's get her the best." Margaret looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and unease. "I don't need this. You've already done so much." Shaq shook his head, his gaze steady. "You do need this, Margaret. We're not stopping here. Trust me, this is just the beginning." Margaret lowered her head, saying nothing more. For the first time in years, she felt she could trust someone, and that, more than any material thing, was the greatest gift she had ever received. The fashion store glowed warmly under the golden lights, its glass windows showcasing luxurious outfits that made Margaret feel like she was stepping into another world. As Shaq pushed open the large glass door and motioned for her to enter, Margaret hesitated, her feet wanting to retreat. "You've already done too much," she said softly, her voice tinged with hesitation. Shaq smiled, leaning down to meet her gaze. "Margaret, today is your day. Don't think about anything else. Let me take care of it." Gently guiding her inside, Shaq led her into the expansive store. The space was vast, with rows of neatly arranged racks, gleaming mirrors, and impeccably dressed staff who greeted them with warm smiles. Margaret stood still, feeling out of place amidst the opulence she had never dared to imagine. A sales associate, likely in his early 30s, approached. He was dressed in a sharp suit and wore a friendly smile, though his eyes briefly assessed Margaret's worn attire. "Mr. O'Neill, we're delighted to assist you. What can we help you with today?" Shaq placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We need some clothes for this lovely lady here. Pick out whatever she needs." The associate looked momentarily surprised but quickly regained his professional demeanor. He bowed slightly and led them to the winter clothing section. Margaret glanced around, her eyes flitting between apprehension and a sense of unworthiness. "I don't know what to choose," she murmured, her voice barely audible in the expansive space. Shaq chuckled, his deep voice breaking the awkward atmosphere. "That's okay. I'll help you. Just pick out what feels comfortable for you." Margaret's eyes wandered to the racks of cozy sweaters, pristine shoes, and thick scarves. She ran her fingers over the soft fabric she hadn't touched in years. Yet, each time she picked something up, she placed it back down, her expression filled with worry. "Just a few basics," she whispered. "I don't want to waste your money." Shaq frowned, placing a gentle hand over her trembling one. "Margaret, don't worry about me. This isn't a waste. This is about making you feel better, more confident. Choose what you need, not what you think you deserve. Let me handle the rest." Eventually, Margaret selected a thick sweater, a sturdy pair of shoes, and a small bag, just the essentials as she saw them. But Shaq wasn't satisfied. He added a heavy long coat, fur-lined gloves, and a warm-knit hat to the pile at the checkout counter. "Anything else, Margaret?" Shaq asked, as if this was only the beginning. Margaret shook her head, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "This is more than enough. I can't accept anything more." "But I can," Shaq said firmly, then turned to the cashier, gesturing at the items on the counter. "Add a few pairs of thick socks, and don't forget a really warm scarf." The cashier nodded, quickly gathering the items. But when he glanced at Margaret, his expression betrayed a flicker of doubt. Lowering his voice, though not enough for Shaq to miss, he muttered, "Does she really need all this, Mr. O'Neill?" Shaq turned to him, the smile vanishing from his face. His eyes grew stern, resolute. "Everyone deserves what they need to live with dignity," he said slowly, each word carrying weight. "And she is no exception." The cashier's face turned pale as he mumbled an apology and resumed his work. Margaret stood in silence, a wave of embarrassment washing over her. But Shaq quickly dispelled the awkwardness with a broad, reassuring smile. "Don't let those words bother you, Margaret," he said. "You don't owe anyone an explanation or proof of your worth. I'm here, and I believe you deserve this." As they left the store, Margaret clutched the bags tightly to her chest, feeling as though she were carrying an entirely new life. She couldn't remember the last time she had owned a new pair of shoes or the comfort of wearing a truly warm coat. Shaq glanced at her, a satisfied smile lighting up his face. "See? I told you today was your day. But we're not done yet. There's more to do." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes brimming with gratitude and curiosity. "There's more?" Shaq winked. "Just wait and see. But first, are you ready for a new beginning?" Margaret didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, now holding things she had never dared to dream of. Slowly, she smiled, a genuine smile filled with hope for the first time in years. "I think I'm ready." And for the first time, Margaret felt that perhaps a brighter future was waiting for her. When Margaret and Shaq stepped out of the store, the soft glow of the streetlights bathed their silhouettes. The shopping bag in Margaret's hands felt like a treasure chest filled with miracles she had never dared to dream of. Every step away from the store was heavy with emotions, yet lighter, as though something deep inside her was beginning to shift. Margaret turned to Shaq, her eyes red but brimming with gratitude. I don't know how I could ever repay you," she said, her voice trembling. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has." Shaq paused and turned to face her. His eyes were serious, yet held a gentle warmth. "You don't need to repay me, Margaret. he said, his tone steady and comforting, "but I want you to promise me one thing." Margaret blinked, tilting her head slightly. "What is it?" Shaq leaned down, placing a firm hand on her shoulder, his gaze piercing yet reassuring. "When the opportunity arises, help someone else, just like I've helped you today, no matter who they are, no matter where you are. Remember, kindness should never stop with just one person." Margaret froze. His words ignited a small flame in her heart, dispelling some of the dark memories and endless days of feeling worthless. She couldn't muster any words, only nodding as silent tears streaked down her hollow cheeks. "I promise," she whispered, her voice quiet but resolute. Across the street, a group of young men stood huddled together, whispering and casting glances at Margaret and Shaq. One of them smirked, his tone dripping with mockery. How pathetic. A guy like Shaq wasting his time on a homeless old woman. Another burst out laughing, adding, "He's probably just trying to build up his hero of the streets image." Shaq heard them. His eyes darkened briefly, but he didn't turn or respond. Instead, he stood taller, his broad shoulders a silent shield protecting Margaret from their cruel words. Margaret, sensing a subtle shift in his demeanor, looked up at him. "What are they saying?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with worry. Shaq shook his head, smiling gently. "Nothing worth worrying about, Margaret. People like them only see the surface. They don't understand what truly matters." Margaret studied him for a moment before nodding. Though the whispers faded from her ears, they stirred memories of the years she had been the target of ridicule. Yet this time, she didn't feel alone. Before they parted ways, Shaq pulled a small card from his pocket and handed it to Margaret. "This is the address of a support center I know. They'll help you find stable housing and connect you with people who can assist you long term." Margaret took the card, her eyes scanning the neat text on it. The thought of having a place to go, somewhere other than a cold sidewalk or a bustling street corner, made her chest tighten with emotion. "Do you think they'll really help me?" she asked, her voice tentative but tinged with a fragile hope. Shaq nodded, his broad smile radiating confidence. "I don't think, I know, and I'll always be here if you need anything." Margaret bowed her head, clutching the card tightly as though afraid it might vanish. "I don't know how to thank you. No one's ever done anything like this for me, not a single person." Shaq patted her shoulder lightly, his voice laced with humor. "You already thanked me, remember? And now you owe me a promise. Don't forget it, Margaret." As Margaret turned to leave, her steps were lighter, yet her heart carried a newfound weight, a feeling not just of gratitude but of responsibility. Her promise to Shaq wasn't merely words, it was the start of something new, a duty she felt compelled to fulfill. Shaq watched her figure disappear into the night. The streetlights cast long shadows and his silhouette stretched across the sidewalk. He knew that, even for just one day, he had made a difference, not only for Margaret, but for everyone who had ever seen her as an invisible shadow. In the distance, curious, judgmental, and even admiring gazes lingered, but Shaq paid them no mind. He smiled to himself and murmured, "Kindness is always the right choice." For Margaret, her journey to change her life was just beginning. Margaret clenched the business card tightly in her hand, as if it were the key to a door she had never dared to dream of. It wasn't just a few lines of text printed on a small piece of paper, it was a declaration. She no longer had to face everything alone. "You're not alone anymore, Margaret," Shaq repeated, his voice deep and steady, as if to engrave the message into her mind. Margaret looked up, her eyes brimming with gratitude and disbelief. "Do you really think they'll help me? Someone like me? Someone the world wants to forget?" Shaq nodded, his gaze unwavering. "They will help. And Margaret, you're not someone the world should forget. You're a human being, a person who deserves recognition and respect." Those words warmed Margaret, seeping through the layers of her thick coat. It had been so long since she'd heard affirmations like that, words she'd come to believe were meant for others, not her. She lowered her gaze to the business card in her hand, and memories surged unbidden. She remembered being chased away from the street corners where she used to sit and beg, shooed off by building managers irritated by the presence of a homeless shadow. She recalled the biting cold of winter nights spent curled up in a tattered blanket, trying to ward off both the chill and the scornful glances of passers-by. She'd knocked on the doors of countless shelters, only to be turned away because they were overcrowded, or because she didn't meet their criteria. The repeated rejection had long since drained her of hope. "But will they be different?" she asked Shaq, her voice barely a whisper. Shaq smiled faintly, as if he could read her thoughts. "I know them, Margaret. They've helped many people like you. You just need to trust them and take one more step." Across the street, curious eyes watched them. A group of onlookers murmured among themselves, their expressions a mix of intrigue and judgment. One of them muttered, "It's strange. Why would Shaquille O'Neal care about someone like her? Maybe he's just trying to get attention." Another added with a hint of cynicism, "Probably just a PR stunt, some kind of performative charity." Shaq heard their comments but didn't turn around or react. He stood firm, like a rock in the swirling currents of meaningless chatter. Margaret, sensing the atmosphere, lowered her head as if to shrink into herself, but Shaq placed a hand gently but firmly on her shoulder. "Don't mind them, Margaret. They don't know your story, and more importantly, you don't need them to understand." After a moment, Margaret gripped the business card tightly and took a deep breath. "I'll go there. I'll try one more time," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Shaq nodded, his smile a quiet encouragement. "Good. I know you can do it. And remember, I'm here if you need anything." Margaret couldn't hold back her tears. She nodded, unable to find the words to express the overwhelming mix of emotions inside her, fragile hope and profound gratitude. As Shaq escorted her to a nearby bus stop, he added, "Tomorrow, go to this center. Tell them I sent you. They'll know what to do." Margaret clutched her newly acquired bag of belongings and the business card in her hand. Her heart swelled with a feeling she hadn't dared name for a long time. Hope. When the bus arrived, Shaq helped Margaret step on board, then paused, meeting her gaze directly. "Remember your promise, Margaret. Help others when you can." Margaret nodded firmly, her voice steadier now. "I promise. I will." The bus doors closed, and it rolled away, carrying Margaret toward a new future where good things might finally begin anew. Shaq stood there, watching the bus disappear from sight. His heart felt lighter, knowing he had planted a seed of hope in the life of someone society had cast aside. In the distance, the curious onlookers continued to whisper, but Shaq didn't care. He smiled, turned around and walked away, continuing his own journey, a journey defined by kindness. The bus, carrying Margaret, pulled away from the station, leaving Shaq standing silently under the soft glow of the streetlight. Night had fallen, and the atmosphere on Hollywood Boulevard seemed to pause, heavy with emotion. What Shaq didn't expect was how quickly the story he had just created would spread. Across the street, curious eyes were more than just observing. Some had discreetly captured the entire scene, from the image of Shaq standing with Margaret at the store, to the tender look in his eyes as he helped her into the spa, to the way he stood up for her against the crowd's judgment. These videos swiftly made their way onto social media platforms. At first, they were just short clips accompanied by captions like, "Shaquille O'Neal just helped a homeless elderly woman in Hollywood. What a beautiful act." A heartwarming story from an NBA legend, kindness still exists. But within hours, the clips garnered thousands of shares, comments, and likes. Many people were moved by Shaq's actions, praising his kindness and humility. This is what the world needs, more people like Shaq. No one knows her story, but Shaq saw something others didn't. Truly admirable. However, not all reactions were positive. Sarcastic comments started appearing, attempting to undermine the significance of his actions. Shaq probably did it just for PR. This is just another way to build his image, nothing more than a publicity stunt. Such judgments came from those who hadn't grasped the full story, people who only saw the surface and missed the deeper meaning. When reporters and journalists reached out to Shaq for interviews about the incident, he simply smiled and shook his head, declining. "I didn't do it to be on the news," he told a close friend. "I did it because I believed it was the right thing to do." Shaq understood that the world might interpret his actions in various ways, but he didn't care. To him, kindness wasn't something to be flaunted or validated. It was simply an act done without expecting anything in return. The story of Shaq and Margaret didn't stop with the viral videos. It became an inspiration for others. Some people shared that they began seeing homeless individuals differently, not with pity, but with respect and empathy. One man commented under a post, "I used to walk past homeless people without a second thought, but this story made me realize that everyone has their own story. Sometimes a small act can change someone's life." At homeless support centers in Los Angeles, there was a noticeable increase in volunteers and donations after the story spread. An employee at the shelter Shaq had referred Margaret to shared, "After Shaq's video went viral, we received so much attention from the community. It's given us more resources to help those in need." Meanwhile, Margaret, once a forgotten figure on the corner of Hollywood Boulevard, was beginning a new chapter in her life. With the shelter's help, she now had a safe place to sleep, free from the cold winds of winter nights. She was provided with warm meals and enrolled in programs to help her find work. Most importantly, Margaret regained a sense of her own humanity, the feeling that she was a person of worth, deserving of respect. Not everyone, however, celebrated this story. A segment of society, driven by skepticism, continued to spread negative rumors about Shaq. They accused him of using the act to clean up his image or boost his public profile. These critics represented a part of society unwilling to accept goodness easily. They doubted everything, ready to twist the meaning of a kind act to fuel their cynicism. But Shaq wasn't fazed by such comments. He understood that kindness isn't always met with understanding. What mattered was that it planted seeds of hope in the lives of those who needed it most, like Margaret. For Margaret, what Shaq did wasn't just about providing a meal, a set of clothes, or a promise. It was the first light she had seen after years of darkness. And, for the world, the story of Shaq and Margaret became proof that kindness has the power to transcend prejudice and judgment. This story didn't end with viral videos or news articles. It lived on in the hearts of those who appreciated the true essence of kindness. And somewhere, other homeless individuals began to hope that one day someone might see them, the way Shaq saw Margaret. Margaret sat by the window of her small room, gazing down at the bustling streets of Los Angeles below. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, filling the cozy, humble space she called home, a word she hadn't dared to think about for a long time. Her hand gently brushed across the small wooden table where she spent her mornings sipping hot tea, reflecting on the journey she had taken. It all began that day when Shaquille O'Neal, a man she never imagined meeting, extended a hand to help her, not just with material support, but as a beacon of hope that pierced through the darkness she had lived in for years. Through the shelter Shaq introduced her to, Margaret began to find stability in her life. The people there not only provided her with a place to stay and hot meals, but also gave her the opportunity to participate in job skill programs. At first, Margaret felt awkward and lacked confidence, but every time she faced a challenge, she remembered Shaq's kind eyes and his gentle reminder, "You can do this." Those words ignited a quiet flame inside her, pushing her forward, one step at a time. She eventually got a part-time job at a small grocery store near the shelter. It wasn't easy for someone who hadn't worked in years, but Margaret didn't complain. In the early days, her feet ached from standing all day, but when she held her first paycheck, she felt a simple yet profound sense of pride. Still, not everything was smooth sailing. Some days, Margaret felt exhausted, as if her grim past was trying to pull her back. One evening, on her way home from the store, a group of people she knew from her homeless days called out to her. "How long will they help you? A month? Then you'll be back here," one of them sneered, his eyes filled with doubt. Margaret stopped in her tracks, their words shaking her resolve. For a moment, she wondered if she could truly change, if all her efforts were futile and she would always be someone forgotten by the world. But then she pictured Shaq, standing tall, shielding her from judgmental gazes, protecting her from harsh words. "No," she whispered, clutching her bag tightly. "I'm not going back." And she walked on, leaving their taunts behind. After a few months, with her savings from the part-time job, Margaret rented a small room in a quiet neighborhood. Modest as it was, that room was a testament to her perseverance, a place she could finally call home. One day, while taking a walk around her neighborhood, Margaret noticed a homeless man huddled on the sidewalk. He looked just as she had in the past, weary eyes, tattered clothes, and a sign with the simple words, "Hungry. Please help." Margaret stopped, her gaze filled with both empathy and determination. She knelt down and handed him a sandwich and a bottle of water she had just bought. When the man looked up, his eyes filled with surprise and gratitude, Margaret smiled and said, "I was once like you, and now I want to help you, just as someone once helped me." Those words weren't just for him. They were a reminder to herself of the promise she had made to Shaq. Not everyone admired her actions, though. A passerby, watching Margaret share her food, shook their head and muttered to their friend, "What a joke. Homeless people helping each other? It changes nothing." Margaret heard the comment but didn't let it bother her. In the past, words like that might have made her falter, but now she understood there would always be skeptics. What mattered most was her purpose, to spread kindness no matter what others said. Margaret and Shaq's story not only transformed her life, but also sparked awareness in the community. Videos and articles about Shaq's act of kindness continued to circulate. But for Margaret, the real value of that day wasn't fame. It was the hope she was given, the feeling of being seen, and the reminder that everyone deserves a second chance. Today, Margaret is no longer the forgotten homeless woman on a Hollywood street corner. She is a living testament to the power of kindness, a reminder that sometimes even a small act can change a life. While the road ahead might still hold challenges, Margaret moves forward with a strong heart and the belief that she, too, can be a light for someone, just as Shaq was for her. Margaret and Shaq's story is proof that even small acts of kindness can lead to monumental change. From someone the world had forgotten, Margaret rediscovered faith in herself and began rebuilding her life, all thanks to the genuine care of a stranger. Do you believe that a small action you take today could change someone's life? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories and perspectives. If you found this story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to spread more of these heartfelt messages to the community. Thank you for being part of our journey.